Next.js is an amazing full-stack framework with features behind it like page-based routing, static site generation, and single-file components. Laravel is a full-stack PHP framework, and thanks to the help by the core team and open-source developers, includes a lot of these same features almost out of the box. To highlight these, I'm going to build a blog and see if Laravel can provide a similar developer experience to that of Next.js. So anyway, let's dive in and get started. Okay, first things first, I have this blank directory. Let's go ahead and create our new project with composer create project, Laravel, in the current directory. And once this finishes up, let's go ahead and open up our source code. And here we have our default Laravel app out of the box. The first thing that I want to do is enable page-based routing, and we can do that thanks to a first-party package from Laravel called Folio. If we take a look at the documentation and scroll down to installation, we only have to run two commands, composer to actually require the package, and then folio install. So let's go ahead and go back into our terminal and run these commands. Composer require Laravel folio, and PHP artisan folio install. Okay, now we should be ready to use this. All right, so if we go ahead and open up our routes web file, we can see that nothing has changed outside of a default Laravel application. We still have this one route here, and it's just returning our welcome view. But the difference lies is if we go into the resources folder and the views directory under there, we now have this pages directory in that. And anything that's in this directory that is suffixed with .blade.php will be displayed whenever the user routes to whatever the name of that file is. So for example, let's create a new page in here, and I'm just going to call this blog.blade.php. So this is where our blog should appear. So I can just create a header that says my blog. And then what happens if we navigate to /blog now, because of the name in this file, it should display what's in this template. So we can go ahead and try that out. Let's open up our terminal first. And we have to start up a local web server to see this in action. Just like you would with Next.js, we can do this with Laravel by using PHP artisan serve, which brings up a local web server at port 8000. So let's go ahead and open this up. And we see our default welcome view here, which is what we expect, but we should be able to go to the /blog page and see what we had in that template file. So we see my blog here as a plain h1 tag. Now this is great, but we don't have any posts associated with our blog right now. So going back into our template file, we should be able to run a for each loop underneath of here and display out each of the posts. So in Blade, we can use the @foreach directive and say for each posts as posts. So we can then just create a listing for each of these posts that we have. Okay, and this looks great, but well, what do we do to actually get these post objects? Normally in Laravel, we'd create a controller or have a function inside of our routes web file that returns back a collection of models. We can't really do that here. Okay, well, before we go further, we should actually create this post model in our application. So going over to the terminal, we'll open up a new tab and run PHP artisan make model posts. We can also add in the migration flag, which will give us the opportunity to create a migration class that allows us to create that post table. And we need a way to pull in this collection of models into this Blade file. Normally in Laravel, you would do something like this inside of a controller or your routes file if you needed to, but because we're using this page-based routing system, everything has to be kind of contained in this Blade file. But this is a normal PHP file anyway, so we can just prefix the top of this with $PHP and put in our dynamic code here. So our post is equal to post all, and then we just end that PHP tag down here, and we should be good to go. If we go back on our front end and refresh, well, we're seeing this connection refused. Now the reason for that is we don't have a database associated with this application yet. Usually out of the box, there's a connection from MySQL, or you can have something even simpler like SQLite. But for my blog, I'd love to be able to store things as flat files like Markdown. That way it'd be easier if I wanted to commit them to something like GitHub. And we can actually do that using a package called Orbit. So this package is from Ryan Chandler, and it's called Orbit, and it's basically a flat file driver for Laravel Eloquent. What this means is that it allows us to replace a database with just flat files, but use the same Eloquent methods that you would be if you were connecting to MySQL or SQLite. All we need to do is run this composer command to install it, and then add in this trait to each of our models associated with these flat files. In our terminal, composer require Ryan GJ Chandler Orbit. And everything installed successfully, so let's go back into our source code and open up this post model. So now all we should have to do is after use has factory is also use this orbital concerns from orbit. So this should automatically associate our model with flat files. Well, going back and refreshing our page, we can see that our error is removed, but we don't have any posts here associated with our blog yet. And this means that two things are true. One is that Orbital is working because we actually have a connection to some kind of database for our posts, but also we don't have any posts associated with our blog yet. We need to create them. The neat thing about this is that we can just create a flat file in order to populate one of these posts. Now you'll notice in our source code, we have this new content directory, and that is where all of the flat files for each model associated with Orbit are going to reside. So if we open it up, we see we have a post directory with nothing in here currently. But instead, we can create a new post object. So if we go and open up a new file, let's go ahead and call this mycoolpost.md for Markdown. And Orbit uses something called front matter Markdown to create attributes associated with each of these files. What that means is that we can have 3 lines, and in between here, we can specify a key value pair that will be available to each of these models. So if we look back in our blade file, we're getting the post title and the post excerpt. So we can have both of these attributes in here, title and excerpt, and then the values after a colon for each of these. So the title is my cool post. And for the excerpt, let's just add in some dummy text. Now, even though we had created this migration here to create a post table, we can't actually use that with Orbit. Instead, what we have to do is we have to define a public static function schema on the model itself, which takes in a blueprint just like a migration does as the parameter. And what we do is we build the schema for each of these models as they will appear in a Markdown file. So exactly like we have in this Markdown file, we need a title and an excerpt. So we can just call table string title, just like we would in a normal Laravel eloquent migration. We can also call table text excerpt and any other attributes that we might need. So if we save this and go back to the browser, we should be able to see our one post here available. And we do. We pulled in a model based on a flat file that is in our app's codebase. And the cool thing about this is that if we start extending this out and actually write a body for our post, so if we add all of this in here, if we go back to the main blade file, there's actually a hidden column available in each of these Markdown files, and it's called content. So if we echo out the content attribute of the post object, we see it's everything that's after those Markdown front matter attributes. But this isn't raw HTML, which is what you would expect to see rendered out from Markdown. But I'll show how to render those out in a little bit. And before we continue, let's go ahead and add some more posts to our content folder so we can populate this blog up a little bit more. Okay, so I went ahead and created 2 more, so we have 3 posts in total. Going back into our browser, we can see those here. And what I want to do is be able to click on each of these and have it be routed automatically to a page where I can read this full version. So in our source code, if we scroll down here to the pages section, anything that is underneath a blog folder will be able to be viewed by the route automatically, just like we saw with this blog page. So if I did /blog/mycoolpost.blade.php, and then I started up a page for my cool posts, we should see that available on the front end. And we do, but the whole purpose that we want is to be able to pull in that content that we have automatically in our Markdown files. And we don't know how many posts we might be able to have, so we need to make this dynamic. And just like with Next.js, Laravel allows us to do this with Folio by allowing us to create a page that is automatically bound to the ID of a particular model. So let's go ahead and delete this page that we have here. And let's go ahead and create a new page under our blog template. And we're going to have this in brackets, post with a capital P, .blade.php. Now what this signifies is that we should be able to automatically pull in a post object that is available inside of this blade file based on the binding of the ID that is inside of the route when you go to it. So just like route model binding works normally with Laravel under like the web.php file, this is happening automatically just based on the title of the file that you're routing to. So if we go back to this route here and refresh, well, we see that we have a 404 error. And the reason for that is the way that we currently have our model set up. So right now, this model doesn't have an ID associated with it because of the way that Orbit works. So normally whenever you would create a model automatically with Orbit, it'll save it based on its ID in this content posts folder. We're creating these automatically from the other side though, so we have to create an attribute that acts like an ID for us so that Laravel can determine what model we're talking about and pull its content into these blade files. And based on how we have structured all of these files so far, I think a slug of the title makes the most sense. So let's go ahead and create a new attribute in our schema, and we'll call this slug. And we need to tell Laravel that this is our primary key for this particular model. So we can say public function get key name, and then we just return slug. So this corresponds to this column here, and that is the key name of this particular model. And then finally, we need to set the get incrementing function to false. So this will not automatically increment each of the models by their ID. We want them to be generated based on the slug attribute of the files that are included. And let's go ahead and add in the return types for each of these as well. So now the last thing that we need to do is actually add in that slug attribute to each of our files. Okay, we can exit out of these. And now let's see if we can automatically pull in this model in our front end. And there we go. So now if we navigate to another post, like example post, we see we have that data automatically pulled in from these Markdown files that are in our application source code. So let's go ahead and populate the rest of this as well. So instead of our post excerpt, we want to just dump out all of the HTML that is associated with this particular post. So we can use this Markdown underneath Illuminate Mail class and call the parse method in it, and then just pass in our post's entire content block. So what this will do is it'll use Laravel's built-in Markdown parser to parse out the Markdown that is in our entire file that we have here. So everything in here will be parsed out and displayed as HTML. And there it is. Well, actually, we don't have to even use this h1 tag anymore. There's our entire post. And if we go to another one, let's go back, we have the exact same data pulled in automatically. Now, if we go back to the main blog post here, we can see that we don't have any links back to any of these posts, but we should probably update that with ones going out to each of these models. So let's go ahead and go back to our blog page. And in all honesty, what we can do here, because we already have this blog folder set up, we don't need to have a blog blade file as well. We can actually put this file underneath of this folder, and we can rename it to index.blade.php. And this works the exact same way functionally. So okay, let's go ahead and update these with some links. So the href is / and then post slug, and we'll just say view more. Oh, actually it's /blog/ and then the post slug. Okay, so now if we go back to our browser and refresh, we see we have 3 links here that we can click on and be navigated to the post of our choosing. And this looks good so far, but the next big piece I want to cover is static site generation. I want to be able to take all of these pages that we've created and store them as flat HTML files already rendered out that we can send out in production on a service like Netlify or Amazon S3. For that, I'm going to use a package called Laravel Export. So this is the repo for it, and if we scroll down, we can see that there's not a whole lot of installation instructions, a composer require, and some vendor publish to publish a configuration file. Let's go ahead and run both of these. So back in our terminal, composer require spatty Laravel export, and then PHP artisan vendor publish to get the config file. Now how this works is it's going to crawl through our site and save every possible page that it comes across as an HTML file. You can also open up the export.php file in the config, and you can set these paths yourself if you want them to be manually exported. So now we can go ahead and open up our terminal, and we can run the command to export this site, php artisan export. It says the files were all saved to a dist directory, so let's see if that's true. Well, we see we have a dist directory, so let's go ahead and open it up and see what's in there. We have a index.html page and we have a blog directory. So let's see what's in the blog directory. And we have an index page, and we have 3 more folders, each one corresponding to a post and an index.html page inside of there. So now we can take this whole dist directory and we can send it out to a service like Netlify or Amazon S3 to host a static site for us with all of the content that we had generated. Okay, so we have page-based routing, we have static site generation. What about things like single file components and server-side rendering that Next.js has as well? Let's go ahead and take a look at a package called Volt. Now, Volt is actually a part of the Livewire ecosystem, not of Laravel itself. Livewire being a way to write interactive and single-page applications using nothing but PHP instead of JavaScript. But this way, we can actually create smaller components using single files instead of a larger class-based structure. So it'll end up looking something like this here. And what we can do is use this to create components that we can put in other places in our application. So back on our blog page on an individual post, I might want something underneath here at the bottom where someone can put their email address and subscribe to a newsletter. Okay, so in the installation, Composer require Livewire Volt and PHP Artisan Volt install. Let's go back into our terminal and run those commands. Composer require Livewire Volt and PHP Artisan Volt install. Okay, and we should be all done. I do think we'll also need to run npm install and npm run dev to get a development environment set up with JavaScript. And we can use the PHP Artisan command make Volt to create a new component. Let's call this one just subscribe. And so we have a new view created, subscribe.blade.php. Let's go ahead back into our source code and open it up. So this gives us a basic scaffold to start with for our functional component. Okay, so here is our basic form. Now let's go ahead and add that into our page to see what this would look like. So again, page is blog post.blade.php. We create a new attribute called Livewire as the prefix, and then colon, and then the name of our component. So Livewire subscribe. And then in the front end, we see our form here as expected. Now we don't have any functionality behind this. If I try to put in an email address and submit it, it just returns back to the same page and puts my email up in the URI. What I want to be able to do is send my email address out through the back end to something like my mailing server so that I can store it and use later. So what we can do is go back to our subscribe component and add in some functionality up here. The first thing we need to do is intercept the form's submission, and we can do that with the wire submit function or attribute. And then this expects a name of a function that we're going to have above. So we can say wire submit, and we'll just call this save. Now up here, save is expected to be a PHP variable. So save is equal to a function. And then in here, we specify whatever happens when this form is submitted. So like I said before, I just want to send this email address out into like a third-party service. So we can use Laravel's HTTP helper. So we can post to our URL, and then I want to send my email address out. And for the URL, I've set up a public endpoint so I can see that whenever we start testing this out. Now, in order to get the actual email from this input down here, what I can do is bind it to some state in Livewire. So I can use this state function that is imported in, and then we have to specify what states we want associated with this component. Well, we just have one, and that's the email address. And then we can provide it a default, which is empty for now. In order to bind it to the actual element though, we use wire model, and then pass in the name of the state object. So for us, that's email. So now whenever this form is submitted, what should happen is that the save function up here is fired off, and our email is sent over to this endpoint. Oh, except right now the email is blank that we're sending out. We need to use the state email that is going to be bound to this input down here. In order to use this though, when we're in the component, we call this and then the state attribute email. So let's go ahead and save this, open up our browser and see if this works. Okay, so let's add an example email address in here and hit subscribe. And okay, nothing happened here, but it looks like we might have something in our endpoint. If we go ahead and click on this, we see that we have gotten a post to it, and we got an email address associated with the same email that we had added in here. So our little component that we had created works as expected. So using these, like with JavaScript and Next.js, we can compartmentalize functionality across our application and include it only where it's necessary. This kind of just scratched the surface of what all of these packages are capable of. I hope you enjoyed the video and saw this as a potential alternative to Next.js. If you have any comments or questions about this, please feel free to reach out to me either in the comments or on my Twitter linked below. Thanks for watching.